The conflict within Georgia and between the Russian Federation and Georgia is a serious challenge to the international community as a whole, endangering European peace and stability, and consequently a serious challenge to the Council of Europe and the values it stands for. There have been violations of the statutes of the organizations, as well as the obligations and commitments undertaken by the two member states. The undertaking to settle dispute by peaceful means, as well as other specific commitments made at the accession of both the Russian Federation and Georgia, have been ignored. The statute's fundamental principles of cooperation and respect of international law, in particular state sovereignty, the right to territorial integrity, and the inviolability of frontiers of states, have been infringed through military action. It is the Chairman's view that the Georgian actions on its territory must be seen in the light of Georgia's obligation under human rights and international humanitarian law. The methods that were used by Georgia to control its territory raises serious concerns as to their compatibility with its obligations. However, the military action undertaken by Georgia on its territory can never be seen as an aggression towards the Russian Federation, which would trigger the latter's right to self-defense. It's furthermore clear that since it contravenes international law when a state uses military forces to protect its citizens in another state, the Russian Federation's large-scale military actions in Georgia cannot be justified as self-defense. Nor is the protection of peacekeeping forces such a basis for the use of force under international law. The use of military forces by and in support of peacekeeping forces is governed by the mandate and other rules pertaining to them. The large-scale military action by the Russian Federation against Georgia cannot be justified on these grounds. The conflict in Georgia has received the full attention of the Committee of Ministers. The Chairman concluded at the end of the ministerial meeting in New York on September 24th that the armed conflict between the Russian Federation and Georgia, within Georgia, and its consequences for the respect of the principles and standards of the Council of Europe are of utmost concern. The situation, he concluded, is a serious challenge to the organization and the values it stands for. Security and development must be based on peaceful settlement of national and international conflicts, as well as respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. Following the Russian Federation's recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the Chairman made a statement in which he condemned this decision and underlined that it seriously jeopardized the possibility of a peaceful resolution of the conflict in line with the principles of international law and contradicting the fundamental principles of the Council of Europe. This and the steps taken by other Council of Europe bodies, in particular the Parliamentary Assembly and the Commissioner for Human Rights, have been detailed in the Chairmanship's report to the extra informal meeting of the Committee of Ministers, which again took place on 24 September in New York, in the margin of the United Nations General Assembly, with 32 ministers participating. I understand the report, as was just mentioned by you, Mr. President, has been distributed to you together with the Chairman's summing up of the meeting. In short, the meeting reaffirmed the seriousness of the conflict and its consequences. The conflict has caused loss of human life and great suffering among populations, including a large number of displaced persons, as well as consequences for the democratic security in the region. Business as usual is not an option for a value-centered organization. This situation requires, we feel, a clear response from the Committee of Ministers in line with the Council of Europe's core objectives of preserving and promoting human rights, democracy and the rule of law. The summing up of the Chairman suggests that enhanced monitoring by the Committee of Ministers of the Russian Federation's and Georgia's obligations and commitments to the Council of Europe should be established. The result should serve as a basis for the Committee of Ministers to decide on such an action plan, including cooperation and assistance with the aim to ensure respect for Council of Europe principles and standards. The cooperation between the Council of Europe and the Russian Federation and Georgia, respectively, should be enhanced in order to strengthen the implementation of human rights, democracy and the rule of law. An enhanced Council of Europe presence in the two countries could be necessary. This means, President, reallocation of resources. The meeting furthermore supported the 6 principles for urgent protection of humanitarian rights and humanitarian security set out by the Commissioner in the special report he published on September 8, 2008. It's paying particular attention to the contribution the Council of Europe can make to implement them. The Chairmanship is closely following your Assembly's urgent debate on the consequences of the war between Georgia and Russia this week. The Assembly's contributions in terms of gathering information on the current situation on the ground and identifying proposals for future action is of great value to the Committee of Ministers. Throughout the crisis, the Chairmanship has had very close contacts with the other international bodies concerned, in particular the United Nations, the European Union and the OSCE. On September 15, Foreign Minister Bildt, together with the OSCE Chairman in office, the Foreign Minister of Finland, Mr. Alexander Stubb, met for a high-level meeting between the two organizations and called for a strict adherence to the 6-point ceasefire agreement which had been mediated by the French European Union presidency. In accordance with the 6-point plan, Minister Stubb and Minister Bildt noted that it's fundamental that the Russian Federation troops return to their position prior to August 7. They also recalled that as member states of the Council of Europe and participating states of the OSCE, both Russia and Georgia are bound by human rights obligations and commitments which must be respected in all circumstances.
The first speaker is Mr. Herkel from Estonia.
Thank you, President. Mr. Belfrage, thank you first of all for your speech. In conflict resolution, the first principle is a right to return home. What are the political preconditions to guarantee this right for the victims of ethnic cleansing who were expelled from Georgian villages in South Ossetia? And additional part of question, why Karoleti checkpoint was exactly today closed for EU's monitors and access to South Ossetia is blocked for the monitors. Thank you.
Please, Mr. Belfrage.
President, what I would like at this point to highlight is the findings of the Commissioner for Human Rights, which you will remember in his action plan suggested a number of suggestions to facilitate the return of displaced persons and refugees. And this plan and this action was encouraged and supported by the ministerial meeting which took place in New York on the 24th of September. It's very important that we give full support to this action. And as I said earlier in my speech, this is part of the proposals by the Committee of Ministers for an action plan which the ministers will hopefully be deciding on later this autumn. With regard to the monitors, I can only tell you that we have felt it very important that the international mechanism for verification has full access, and this has been a subject of, as you know, very animated discussion between the parties, and also the number of member states in the Council of Europe as members of the European Union have also been very clear on the subject.
Thank you very much. Mr. Herkel was intervening on behalf of EPP Group. Now, Mr. Chop from the United Kingdom on behalf of EDG. Mr. Chop.
Mr. President, has the Russian Federation agreed to cooperate with the enhanced monitoring being established by the Committee of Ministers? And what if it doesn't actually cooperate? What are the sanctions? And can you answer those cynics who say that expulsion could never be considered by the Council of Europe of a country like Russia because we couldn't afford to replace the money that Russia provides to the Council?
Secretary of State.
Of course, this plan, or the number of the measures which were discussed by ministers at their informal meeting in New York last week, had among them the question about the monitoring effect. And as you've just heard, I was commenting at length on this avenue, which we feel would be important. And of course, that is a recommendation and a suggestion which will be subject to consultations with all parties concerned, including the Russian Federation.